Yeah, I said it. You spellcasters are all just dirty button mashers, and I'm tired of the bias in game design about it. Bombastic openers aside, today's video is going to be discussing differences between the use of paper buttons, as we see in games like D&D 4e, and games like Shadowdark, which purport to have moved us away. Now, this won't be a video about whether paper buttons are good or bad, but about biases I see within the community of designers and players, because I think we're not thinking through this clearly. So, as we always do on this channel, let's define the term and dig in. A paper button is a discrete ability in a tabletop role-playing game that you use to accomplish a concrete effect within the game. So things like a magic missile spell that is pretty concrete as to how it works and the damage it deals and what sort of situations it would be relevant in. Or in 4th edition, maybe a cleaving power that lets you hit multiple enemies. This is something you press while playing to activate something concrete. It doesn't require a discussion between you and the GM to adjudicate, it's just pretty much known how it's going to work. And one of the best examples of a game built on paper buttons would be 4th edition D&D. You can open to any class page within the book and see just dozens of paper buttons. All sorts of cool abilities like a warlock spell called Eyebite or Dread Star, or we could flip over to the rogue and we see Setup Strike and Chameleon and Walking Wounded. Just nothing but paper buttons. Every class in D&D 4th edition uses the same button structure of at-wills, encounters, and dailies. And that is everything you can do primarily as a character in that game. So gameplay moment to moment is each player choosing which buttons they'd like to press on that turn. And again, there's nothing wrong with that approach. It's a very different kind of game than maybe people who are used to the other editions of D&D are accustomed to. But it's an example of a whole game built on paper buttons. In recent times, games like Daggerheart and Draw Steel also have leaned a little bit into the paper button status. Daggerheart's domain cards and all of the Draw Steel abilities are paper buttons. That's not wrong, but it is a very distinct style. What you can do is then defined by those features. And this style of gameplay can be super fun, especially for marshals, because now they get all the cool toys that everybody gets. They can push all the fun buttons and do cool flying strikes and all this neat stuff that normally was just reserved for the spellcasters. Everybody has the same level of complexity, the same level of paper button pressing. And it's not a surprise that games like Daggerheart and Draw Steel are doing quite well and leaned into that. It is quite fun. It's not the answer for every role-playing game, but we have to respect its value in those games. And now, the detractors of this style are just as valid in their perspective as well. You'll see this a lot in the OSR community. Professor DM has an excellent video talking about being shackled and caged by your character sheet in a role-playing game, and how that really kills the fantasy, kills the immersion, and the player's ability to creatively problem solve. If they're just hitting the same sequence of buttons over and over again, they're not really engaging in what makes role-playing games special. That's that perspective. But this is where I think we see a bias creeping in between the Marshall-caster divide. Now, to make my point, I'm going to look at 2 tabletop role-playing games that I've purchased, and I don't want what I'm about to say to be construed as a criticism of these games. Don't take it that way at all. These games are awesome, I'm a big fan, but this is an observation of the dialogue that surrounds their design and that outlook of gameplay. So again, not a criticism of these games. I think they're awesome, I love them, but let's look at what I'm talking about here. The first game I'd like to look at is Shadowdark. Now, awesome game, probably one of the most successful OSR games ever in the modern times, super well supported. Kelsey's awesome for designing it. But I think there's a surprising amount of paper buttons in this book, and I think this is where some of the bias can be most clearly seen. And remember, Shadowdark is an OSR book, and so it's meant to capture that rulings over rules, and it's supposed to be that freedom of play. It's definitely held up to that standard, and it's well-deserved. But let's take a look at a few things here. So we have the fighter class, which is a classic, of course, and like all the classes in the game, it's basically just one page to cover everything you need, and that's all you need to make your fighter. And then during gameplay, you're supposed to engage with the story and with the GM to be creative in how you solve problems. You don't just say, I walk up and swing my sword. You describe in greater detail about swinging at the monster's leg to try to slow it down, or the classic swing from a chandelier yourself to get to higher ground. You're not meant to be shackled to the sheet, which is why your class is so simple. You're meant to engage with the story and the scene and the world. But let's talk about spellcasters now, because spellcasters, starting on page 54, have almost 20 pages of spells they get to pick from and utilize. That's quite a bit. In fact, that's more than all the class pages combined doubled. And a large percentage of these are paper buttons. Things like Hold Monster, Holy Weapon, Burning Hands, Command. These are very concrete in what they do and how they can be used in a scene. Now, of course, you can be creative with their application within a scene, but for example, Acid Arrow is pretty concrete on how it works. So is Alter Self and Anti-Magic Shell. And those are all very much paper buttons. Now, you can't push them an unlimited times per day because of the spellcasting role, but these spellcasters get more features, more special things they can do that require no GM adjudication than all the classes combined on their bare features. And remember, the clerics and wizards can still engage just as much as the fighter or thief in the environmental storytelling and creative problem solving, right? They're not limited to those paper buttons. They can still engage in that really awesome rulings over rules way. But the fighter and thief can't. They must engage in that conversation in order to do anything apart from the most basic swing of their sword. They don't have those extra features, those extra paper buttons they can do in addition to that. And remember, this is not a criticism of Shadowdark. I'm not saying that's a problem. Shadowdark is attempting to evoke the old school D&D gameplay, which was very much like this, where the spellcasters had these spells that they can do. They've moved away from Vancian spellcasting, of course, into what is probably cooler in the spellcast role, but it very much is still accomplishing the goal it wants. That's not a problem with Shadowdark. I'm pointing it out as a way to show you how even within very rulings over rules type of structures, we actually see a ton of paper buttons still. And these concrete paper button spell lists are not the only way to do magic in tabletop role-playing games. That's not some sacred cow that you must include. There are games that try other approaches. That's why I think Vagabond is going to be interesting in this conversation, because it's attempting to break up some of that paper button style of spellcasting and make it a little bit more free form. But it still leaves the marshals out of the conversation. And like in Shadowdark, Vagabond fits all of the class features for a given class on a single page. It's great. It has this cool piece of splashy art and all the features you need to play a Vanguard right here on the page. Looks very cool, very efficient, and whether you're a spellcaster or a marshal, you get this one page. But just like Shadowdark, we're going to see that the spellcasters actually have a whole other game they get to play. And now, this isn't a criticism of the spellcasting system here in Vagabond. Actually, the opposite. I think the spellcasting system is very cool. With spellcasting, instead of having a concrete list of spells that just do one thing, you can shape your magic in various ways by spending increasing mana. So instead of a spell list, instead you get a list of core effects that you can play with, like a blink, a burn, a gas, a freeze, exalt, fade, dispel, and then you can sculpt them in the scene for various effects, turning them into buffs for all of your players nearby, or an explosion or a line effect. You can play with them in many different ways, making them instant versus duration. It's very cool, very versatile, and the spellcasters then are engaged in a conversation at the table whenever they do want to create an effect. But just like Shadowdark, the spellcasting list is larger than all of the martial class features combined. And so, once again, we do have a situation where the spellcasters get to play a different game than the marshals, and the marshals don't have anything to compensate for that. And again, this isn't about balance or anything like that. It's not about whether or not this is valid or not. This is totally valid. Great game. What it's about is whether or not we're forcing the mundane characters, the non-magical ones, to engage in that GM player environmental discussion in a way that we don't apply to the spellcasters. Because when I was flipping through Vagabond, which was an absolute treat, I kept thinking, oh man, what if there was a similar system like this for marshals, where instead of spending mana, they spend stamina, and they can have all sorts of concrete base effects they can work with and then leverage creatively in the scene, like tacking on a bleed or a cleave or a pierce. Just give them building blocks that they can construct their own paper buttons from in a way that doesn't require that adjudication. At least then, it's equivalent to the spellcasters. They get to play just as engaging a game as the magic users. And now, I know that's not the goal of these games. Neither Shadowdark nor Vagabond wanted to make complex martial characters, and that is okay. But when we're talking about these games, I think we have to be honest with whether or not they include paper buttons or not. Because, like I said, there are more paper buttons in Shadowdark than there are class features for everybody else. It's quite a bit. We can't ignore that in our discussions as game designers. We need to be more cognizant of that. Because let me posit for you an alternative version of these. You could design a game like Shadowdark, where there are no spells, where whether you're a fighter or the wizard or the cleric or the thief, you have the same level of paper buttons as the others. None. The magic users could simply have access to a few different magical weapons that maybe have some sort of elemental alignment, like this wand is a fire wand and does a d6 fire damage, this other one's a cold wand and it does a d6 cold damage, and that's the only difference between them. And then any effect they'd like to create that is magical would require that they engage with the GM and the environment to the same level as the thief and the fighter. Does that sound appealing to you? Well, that's not really about whether it's good or bad, but that would be the same level of paper buttons across an entire game's design, rather than giving one type of character access to paper buttons and denying it from the other. And I don't want to see anybody in the comments talking about what's realistic or not when it comes to martial-caster divide. That is not the point here. Realism has no purpose in the conversation when it comes to tabletop role-playing game design, especially fantasy design. When there are dragons and beholders and magic missiles flying everywhere, is it really unbelievable that the marshals would be capable of great feats of strength? No, it's not. It doesn't really matter in this context, but I see no reason that any hero in the story should be any more heroic than the other when it comes to how they're designed. Now, to sort of wrap up, again, this is not a criticism of Shadowdark, nor a criticism of Vagabond, nor a criticism of 4th edition D&D. These are just different design ideologies we're exploring here. But if you can take one thing away from this video, it's to understand that our familiarity with a type of structure doesn't mean that structure isn't a paper button. Just because we're used to spells being these concrete lists of features that we get to have access to when we're spellcasters, doesn't mean it has to be that way in every game. That may have been the right decision for Kelsey in Shadowdark, or the more loose structure for Tarrant, who made Vagabond. These are both legitimate. But when you are designing your game, you need to also think about what you're saying about the types of characters the players get to make. Are some of them forced to exclusively engage with the GM in an environmental storytelling Mother May I situation, broken free from their character sheet entirely, right? Only needing to reference their modifiers occasionally. But at the same time, giving other types of characters access to super cool paper buttons that they can play with, in addition to being able to have that conversation with the GM. That is a martial caster bias that we see in many different games. And as a big fan of the guy with a sword and a shield and nothing else between him and the monster, no magical spells, no gods to protect him, just your everyday soldier trying to fight back the darkness, I want that character to be treated with the same level of awesomeness and cool decisions and fun abilities as any other in the game. So that's what I'd like you to think about. Let me know what you think in the comments. I know this one was a little bit more ranty than a lot of my videos, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are on paper buttons and the Marshall-Caster divide. Again, this is not to say that all games need to be designed this way, but it's something I want people to really think hard about when they're talking about their favorite role-playing games. All right, that's enough for me for today. I hope you all enjoyed this. If you'd like to get more out of this channel, we do have a Discord server, a Patreon, and a closing any minute now Kickstarter page. All of the links will be down below, and I hope to see you here next week on Tales from Elsewhere.